So, I'm really excited to be talking to you guys today because I feel like over the last few weeks, God has been like really intentional about what He's doing with us and where He's taking us. Pastor Rick has brought several words talking about bearing fruit, right? If you guys remember a few weeks ago, he had the trays of fruit here, and he was talking about the followers who bear no fruit, who bear some fruit, who bear more fruit and much fruit. So I think God is teaching us that we're ready to go on to the next level, right? God is ready to do something great in our lives. And for some time, Pastor Rick has been asking me, hey, I want you to one Sunday share your testimony. I want you to tell a little bit about, your life and some of the things that you've gone through. And I've shared a little bit last time that I spoke about anxiety. But he said, no, I want you to tell a little bit more about your story. And I think it goes in line with what he's been talking about and in line with the last song, Waymaker, right? So that song, Waymaker, says that God is able to make a way, right? Able to make a way where there's no way or where you think that it's impossible. And so for a long time in my own personal life, I struggled a lot with, does God have a calling over my life? Like that was a big struggle that I had. I always heard preachers say, God has something great in store for you. God is calling you, right? Last Sunday, we spoke about being marked, right? And so the preacher was saying, you are marked, right? And so I'd be sitting there and I'd be thinking, okay, who's you? Is you me? Is you you? Who's marked and what am I marked to do and what do I do with this, right? I had some kind of something inside of me, a little bit of excitement at the idea that God could potentially want to use me to do something, right? And I was excited about that, and I did want to say, yes, please use me, do whatever you want with me, I trust you to do that. But what, like what exactly is it that I'm going to do, and what does that look like? And so I struggled with it for a long time. And then as I started allowing myself to dream a little bit and to start asking God, okay, well, what is it that you want me to do? And then I started getting a little bit inspired and thinking, well, there's a lot of need in the world, and I want to be one of those people who can help meet a need, right? I want to be one of those people that makes an impact. And then I remembered who I was, and I was like, how can I make an impact? I really don't have a whole lot to offer. But then I was in a Sunday school class. I was a teenager, and I remember being in that Sunday school class, we were talking about something called the butterfly effect. Has anybody ever heard of the butterfly effect? No? So it's a theory, it's a science theory, right, that says that the flapping of the wing of a butterfly is enough to cause a hurricane, right? I'll say that again. It's a theory that says that the flap of a wing of a butterfly is strong enough to cause a hurricane. But if you think about that, that sounds impossible, right? I mean, how thin is a butterfly's wing? It's super thin, right? And so if a butterfly flaps its wing, how could that possibly create a hurricane? Well, a hurricane creates because there's an accumulation, right, of waves of wind or whatever you may call it. It's the accumulation of waves of wind or heat waves or temperature, and at some point, there's one more wave that tips off that hurricane, right? It doesn't need to be a big wave because remember, it's the accumulation of all of these other waves that finally lead to a hurricane. It's not just one big gush of wind that creates it, it's the accumulation of multiple gushes of wind, right? And so it could be that you're at that tipping point, right, where it's just about to form a hurricane, but you need that tiny, tiny, tiny piece more of wind in order for the hurricane to form. And so if a butterfly happens to flap its wing, that's exactly what the hurricane needed in order for it to grow or to form. If the wings had not flapped, it wouldn't have formed, right? And so I was sitting there listening to that, and the lesson basically was, what about if you're it, right? What about if you are destined to be at a specific moment in time and all of these people came before you, right? And time is waiting for you to be obedient and to do something. It might be small in your eyes, right? But all of these other people have done things in anticipation of you being obedient and doing that one thing, whether it be great or whether it be big in your sight. They're waiting for that one thing to happen in order for something greater to occur, right? It's waiting for you. And so somebody told me that, and I was like, okay, if God is calling me to do something, it's not like I'm the only person in the world who's going to do this thing. All these other people ahead of me got me to a point where I can step into, right? I can step into my calling, build on what they have already done, and allow God to continue even beyond me, right? So it took me some time to learn that. And so once I got into this idea that, okay, maybe God can use me, maybe he can do great things, I started thinking, okay, well, what is it that I want to do, right? And I started getting these crazy thoughts in my head, and I was like, well, I want to be a missionary. I literally thought that I want to be a missionary, and I was young. I didn't know how to be a missionary, but I decided that's what I'm going to do. I mean, I really felt like God was calling me to be a missionary. So I feel bad for my parents. I didn't tell them this. I went out. I got all the paperwork I needed to get my passport. I got my passport picture taken. I did everything I needed to do, except I needed their signature, right? To get your passport, you need your parents' signature. So I went to my parents with all the paperwork done, and I was like, here, Mom, you need to sign right here. I'm going to, in my mind, I'm going to go to Venezuela, and I'm going to go on a mission trip to Venezuela. Can you sign here, please? And that's all I told her. And my mom was like, what? Where, why, with whom? You're not old enough to go to Venezuela? What are you doing? And I was like, no, Mom, I'm going to go. And somehow I got her to sign, and she signed the paperwork. And not long after that, I ended up on a mission trip. I think the first one was Venezuela. Eventually, I went to Panama. And I'll tell you a story about while I was in Panama. I'm there in Panama, and I'm thinking, what am I doing here? I got all excited about it, and suddenly I'm here, and it's like, okay, what am I going to do now? And when we were in Panama, we were in an area that was stricken by a lot of violence, so a lot of like gang violence type of thing. And we were in a neighborhood where it was hard to find someone who had not been affected by death. Almost everyone we came across knew someone who was murdered because the violence was so great. And our focus during that mission trip was kids, right? So we were focusing on kids, and we were going door to door at that time, just talking to people and inviting kids to come to like a VBS type of event. And so we're freaking out a little bit because our host at the country were saying, you can't go to that house because the people in that house are a member of this gang, and you can't walk on that street because that's the opposite gang. And so we're like, okay, just tell me where to go, what to do, who to knock on, not to knock on. So we were on the edge a little bit, but long story short, we got all of the kids in that particular neighborhood to come. And we were, ministering to the kids. We were having a lot of fun. We had an altar call for the kids. And the presence of God was like super, super strong. Like if you've ever seen a child experience the presence of God, it's like the most amazing thing that you will ever see. So we were there, and I remember somebody else was ministering, and my job was to pray for the kids. And so we had them all on the altar, and I would go behind them, and I would pray for them. And there was this one kid who, I don't know why, I felt like I needed to hug him, right? And so I did. I gave him a hug, and he started sobbing. I mean, he's just sobbing and sobbing, and he just kept crying and crying and crying. And I'm like, what do I do? I was like, all I could think to say was, God loves you. That's all I could think to say. And as I would say that, he would sob more and more, and he just kept crying. And then, I'm having this moment with this kid, and I'm praying for him, and I turn around, and some other little kid is like tapping on my shoulders, and I'm like, yeah, what's up? What do you need? And he's like, I want that. Whatever that is, I want that. He literally told me that. I want that. And I was like, okay, come. So then I hugged him. So I was hugging him, and he was crying. And then there was a line of kids after that, just waiting for that. And I was like, wow, in that moment, I was like, okay, God, you're doing something, you're doing something. I didn't understand it, but I got a taste of it. And then I was like, all right, what more do you got, God, And that's how I kind of began my journey. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that story. But what we're going to do today is kind of read from the book of Samuel. First Samuel talks about Samuel, who was being called by God. So I want to show you Samuel's initial experience when God was calling him, and then I want to tell you a little bit about my own experience when I felt that, God had something for my life, and as I was trying to figure it out. So as you guys know, I'm a psychologist, and that is part of what I believe is my calling and my purpose in life. And whenever I introduce myself to people as a psychologist, everyone's always freaked out. They think that I'm going to psychoanalyze them or I'm reading their mind. Or it's always a funny experience whenever I meet people. But there's one in particular that I always get a laugh from. There was a young man that I had mentored some time ago, and he was like really excited that somebody who was a doctor was his mentor. And I remember one day I was shopping at Target, and I was just shopping for whatever, and I see him, and I go up to him, and I'm like, "Hey man, how are you?" And he froze, and then he couldn't talk, and I was like, "Are you okay? What's going on?" And he's like, "I'm sorry, I didn't think people like you shopped here." And I was like, "People like me?" And he was like, "Yeah, I didn't know doctors came to Target." And I was like, "Well, where do you think we go? Is there like a doctor store where we get our groceries or our napkins or whatever?" There isn't. But sometimes people think, that because you have done something extraordinary, and extraordinary I mean something that not a lot of people do, right? So not a lot of people are doctors, so it's something extraordinary. Sometimes when you see somebody that has done something extraordinary, you think that that person is extraordinary, but they are not. I am not an extraordinary person. I am just like everybody else. I'm an ordinary person who God used to do an extraordinary thing, right? And a lot of times when you come across people who you see on a stage, right, or you see a business owner, or you see an author, and you're like, yeah, that's amazing, but there's something extraordinary about that person that allowed them to have their own business. Or there's something extraordinary about that person that allowed them to write the book, right? It isn't like that. We are all ordinary people who God uses to do extraordinary things, right? And it took me a really, really long time to figure that out, right? When I had that idea in my mind that, okay, God's calling me, I got through the missionary thing. I almost became a missionary, like literally. I was going to go to school to be a missionary, but then I felt like God was like, no, that's not what I have for you. I want you to do this other thing. I want you to go and become a doctor. Then I was like, what? A doctor? I was like, I can't be a doctor. There's no way. I don't know a doctor. I don't know what that takes. It was a crazy, crazy idea. But I went on this journey where little by little, step by step, God showed me I can do extraordinary things with you, a very ordinary person. And it was an amazing journey, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit about it today. So what we're going to be talking about today is 5 reasons why we may not recognize God is calling us. 5 reasons why we may not recognize that God has a purpose and a calling over our lives. So we're going to start off by reading from the book of Samuel. So 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. It says, the boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. So we have Samuel. He was ministering or working for Eli, who was a priest. All right. So Samuel was a young boy. He was working for Eli, who was a priest. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was laying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was laying down in the house of the Lord where the ark of God was. So again, Samuel's a young boy. He works for Eli the priest. There was one night where Eli the priest was asleep, right? So Eli went to sleep, Samuel went to sleep. As he was sleeping, the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." So Samuel was asleep, Eli was asleep. God starts to call Samuel. Samuel wakes up, and he runs to who? Eli the priest, right? He didn't recognize that it was God. So he ran to Eli the priest, and he said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call you. Go and lay down." He was like, "Why did you just wake me up? I was in a deep sleep. Go lay down, leave me alone." So Samuel went and lay down. Again, the Lord called in verse 6 and said, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me." So again, second time, Samuel runs to Eli, wakes him up and said, "You're calling me. What do you need?" "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lay down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. That means he hadn't yet heard God speaking to him. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The third time the Lord called Samuel. And Samuel got up and he went to Eli again. "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lay down, and if he calls you again, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went, he laid down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as the other time, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." So again, just to summarize the story, we have Samuel, who was a young boy, right? He worked for the priest Eli. Both Eli and Samuel were asleep. One night, God called Samuel. He literally said, "Samuel," right? Woke him up out of his sleep. Samuel did not recognize that it was God that was calling him, so he ran to the priest Eli. The priest Eli said, "It wasn't me. Go back and go to sleep." And this happened 3 times. Finally, Eli told him, "Hey, this isn't me calling. It's probably God. Next time he calls you, answer him, right? Don't wake me up anymore." So, sometimes what happens to us is we don't hear God calling us, right? That is reason number 1 why sometimes we miss his call, or we don't realize that God has a purpose for our lives. It's because we miss him. We don't recognize that God is actually calling. And that's what happened to Samuel in the Bible. He didn't recognize God. And what I thought was really interesting about it is, sometimes we assume that people who don't know Christ wouldn't recognize God, right? But people who know Christ, you would think that we would recognize him, right? But Samuel actually was a servant of God. Samuel actually lived with the priest. He was a servant of God. If you look at 1 Samuel 2:11, it says, "But the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli." Verse 18, it says, "But Samuel was ministering before the Lord." Verse 19 says, "Each year Samuel's mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice." So Samuel was devoted. Samuel lived with the priest. He served the priest. He didn't even live with his parents, right? So Samuel was very, very devoted to God, and yet Samuel did not recognize God's calling, right? So it's not like he didn't recognize God's calling because he was in sin or he wasn't serving God. He just did not recognize that God was calling him, right? And that happens to us sometimes. We don't recognize that God is calling him. Now, I think one of the reasons why Samuel didn't recognize it was God calling him was because God was calling Samuel to do something that was too great, to do something that was too big for Samuel. So God was waking Samuel up to give him a prophecy. That's why he was waking him up. He was waking him up because he was going to give him a prophecy. God was calling Samuel to be a prophet. Now, not a big deal, right? There's a lot of prophets in the Bible. It is a big deal in Samuel's case. It's a big deal for 2 reasons. Number 1, Samuel was about 11 or 12, right? Very young, being called to do a very big job. Number 2, there were no formal prophets at that time. Samuel would have become the first formal prophet. Some prophecies had happened prior to that, but he would be the first person that would step into the role of becoming a prophet, right? So that's what made God's calling overwhelming to Samuel. He was too young, right, in Samuel's eyes. And number 2, God was asking him to be the first to do something great, right? For some of us, we're in that same position. We don't recognize God's calling because you may be the first in your family. You may be the first in your neighborhood. You may be the first person that you know that God is calling to do something great, right? You might be the first. You might be the first person. And those around you might not understand what God is calling you to do. And you might be overwhelmed with what God is calling you to do. That was definitely my personal experience. I felt like God was calling me to do something that was way beyond my ability, something that was out of reach for me. And so I dismissed it for a long time. I was thinking, okay, yeah, I mean, who doesn't want to be a doctor? Everybody wants to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. Who doesn't want to do that? But I dismissed it as that's just too great for me. And sometimes we make that mistake. We just dismiss what God is calling us to do because we feel that it is more than what we're able to do, right? It's a calling that's greater over our lives. But God is calling you to do something great, right? He is calling you. And if Samuel could do it, if Samuel could be 11 or 12 years old, get his calling, go on to become the first prophet to officially have that role, you could do what God is calling you to do. He's calling you for a reason, right? He's planted that seed inside of you for a reason, right? It's there for a reason. So sometimes we begin to inch towards our calling, right? But then as we begin to inch towards it, sometimes we start thinking, all right, I feel a little bit uncomfortable, right, about stepping into my call. Like imagine Samuel as he's giving his first prophecy, which he did. Guess who his first prophecy was to? It was to Eli, the priest, and it wasn't a pretty prophecy, right? He was basically telling Eli that he was doomed. So it was not a good prophecy, right? So imagine Samuel. He heard from God. God said, you're going to be a prophet, and here's your first task. Go and tell your boss, basically, this prophecy that essentially tells him you're going to die, basically, in other words. Imagine that. So as Samuel is walking back to Eli again, right, after he already woke him up a million times, now he's walking to him again the following day to give him that prophecy. He struggled with that, right? Samuel struggled with that. At one point, he was thinking, okay, am I letting this prophecy thing get to my head? Who am I to tell Eli this horrible news? Who am I to prophesize over them? And so sometimes when we're stepping into what God has called us to do, we enter this zone of discomfort, right? It is uncomfortable when you're doing something new for the first time. And so sometimes we start thinking, all right, this uncomfortable feeling that I have, it's probably because I'm trying to do something that is beyond my capacity, right? I am trying to do something that is more than what I am able to do. And that was Samuel's experience. As he stepped into becoming a prophet, he wondered, all right, can I really do this? And is this really God? Could God really be calling me to be a prophet? Could he really be calling me, Samuel, to be a prophet? And he struggled with that. He struggled with, is it me trying to do more than what I'm capable of? So many of us ask ourselves that question, all right, let's say I have in my mind, I want to have a business, and I feel like this is what God is calling me to do. But as I start stepping into it and I realize all of the intricacies of having a business and how hard this is and all of the things that I do not know, fear creeps in, right? And at that time, you start asking yourself, okay, am I trying to bite on more than I can handle, right? Am I taking on more? And so I think we find an answer to this problem in the Bible when we're struggling about wondering, am I really capable of doing more? The answer is yes. And we find it in the book of Matthew, chapter 25, the parable of the talents. I'll read it to you briefly. Starting in chapter number 14, it says, again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag. Then what he did after that, he went on his journey. And he came back. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought back the other 5. The master said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Then the man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. His master replied, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. "Master," he said, "I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sowed and gather where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went out and I hid your gold in the ground. See, here it is, what belongs to you." His master replied, "You wicked and lazy servant, so you knew that I harvested where I had not sown and gathered where I have not scattered seed. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the banker, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest." So essentially what happens is you have a master, right? He has 3 different people he's giving money to. To one, he gave 5 bags of gold. To one, he gave 2 bags of gold. To one, he gave 1 bag of gold, right? The guy with the 5 bags of gold, he goes out, he invests it, right, and brings back double. Same thing with the guy who had 2 bags of gold. He goes out, he invests it, he brings back double. But the guy that had 1 bag of gold, he was scared, right? He was scared. Why was he scared? Because he only had 1 bag of gold, right? He was thinking, what if I mess up, right? And I don't get anything back? What am I going to do? I don't want to mess up, this gift that my boss has given me. And so he was scared, right? And he was ultra conservative with his gift, to the extent that his gift didn't grow and it actually faded out. All he did was he buried it. So what we learned from this is, number one, God has given everyone a talent, right? He has given every single person a talent, right? Maybe not in the same measure and maybe not the same talent, but every single person has a talent, right? And what the Bible is telling us here is that you have to do something with your talent. That is the only way to grow. That's the only way to be productive and to produce more. If you have a talent and you keep it to yourself and you do nothing with it, you're not going to be fruitful, right? You're not going to enjoy it. Like the guy who had 1 talent, he buried it. So he didn't enjoy it, and neither did anybody else. Nobody got anything out of it. So we learned from this that if you do nothing, you get nothing. Literally, you get nothing. You have to take whatever talent is inside of you, and you have to take a step forward, and you have to use that talent, right? And that is the only way that God's going to be able to multiply it. See, but sometimes we are like standing on the edge of a cliff, right? And we're about to jump, and we're about to take on the calling. We're about to dare to apply for that new job. We're about to dare to go back to school. We're about to dare to write that new song. And then we stop ourselves because we're afraid that we're going to fail, right? And we don't want to take that risk. And so whatever talent or dream or passion God has given us, we bury it, right? We bury it because we're afraid of failure, right? We're afraid that we're not going to be able to prosper with it. But God is saying, you have to try, right? You have to try. This was one of the areas where I personally struggled the most. I struggled with failure, right? Especially when I was trying to pursue this calling that I thought was much greater than me, and a calling that I thought was impossible. So you guys know I went to FSU. That's where I graduated, the best university in the world. So at FSU, it's huge. It's a huge school. There are about 50,000+ students at FSU. That's a lot of students. That's more than the population of Immokalee, all right? That's a whole lot of students at FSU. And so the program that I was in to become a psychologist, out of those 50,000 students every year, they accepted 1 to 3 students every year, 1 to 3 students. So I was thinking to myself, out of 55,000 people that are at this school, how am I going to be one of the 3 that they select, right? And so since the odds are so great, I had to apply to other schools, and it hurt me, but I did. I applied to UM, I applied to UF, I applied to all of them, right? And I remember UF called me, right? And they said, hey, we got your application. We want you to come and visit. And they had like this orientation, and I was like, oh, wow, okay, somebody called me. Maybe I can do this, right? And so I was excited. I went to UF, and they had this whole talk, and they had a really nice lunch, and I was all excited. And as part of that orientation, we got to meet with individual advisors. And so when it was my turn to meet the advisor, we were talking, and and I asked him, frankly, I was like, hey, I know you guys haven't made your decisions yet, but do you think I'm gonna get in? Like, do you think I have a chance? And he was like, well, let me go look at your file. So he went, he looked at his file, he came back, and he was like, I'm sorry, man, no. Like, literally, he was like, no. He was like, you're not gonna make it. He was like, you don't have the grades, you don't have the scores, you don't have it, you can't do it. And I was like, wow, why'd you guys call me? What am I doing here? And he was like, he's like, I'm sorry, man, I really don't know why we called you. And this was like at noon. It was a 8-hour event, and he was like, so I was like, so should I just go home? And he was like, yeah. So, so I went home at noon, right, for the 8-hour event. And as I was driving back home, I was like, you see, I knew it. I was like, I knew it. I knew I wasn't meant for this. Like, I knew that I was not qualified to be one of the 55,000 people. I knew that. And it was a very discouraging moment for me, right? But in my mind, I was like, okay, well, at least I know what I can't do. I know what my reality is. And I started to accept that, right? I started to accept that I was ordinary enough not to make it, right? I knew it, and I was convinced of it. But God worked in me, right? And he was like, don't give up. It's okay. And so in my journey, one of the things that I've learned is that you have to be active, right? If there's something you're passionate about, if there's something you want, if there's something you like, you got to put work into it, right? It's not just going to happen to you. So if you're into singing and you see yourself recording music one day, you better be singing. You need to get up and you need to practice, and you need to listen to other people who are doing what you want to do. You need to be reading. You need to be watching videos. You can't just sit there in your couch and one day become the greatest singer in the world. You have to put work into it, right? And so that's one of the things that I did learn on my journey. So despite my discouragement, I had this little book. And the little book was about how to get to graduate school. That's what it was. It was a book to teach you how do you become one of those 3 people out of 55,000 that they select. And so I'm reading the little book, and in the book, on one of the pages said, after you submit an application, write a personal email to the person you sent the application to. And then it said, say the following: hey, I am very thankful for the opportunity to apply for your school. And I was like, I know you're very busy, but if you have the time, I would love to sit and talk to you. So I copied that word for word, and I sent the email. And the lady answered me. She was like, sure, can you come tomorrow? And I was like, you're 5 hours away, but sure, I'll get in my car and I'll cancel everything I have and I'll go tomorrow. So I drove 5 hours to FSU. It was FSU who wrote me back. And I'm sitting with the lady. Her name was Dr. Pravad, and we're talking and just talking about school and what we wanted to do. And finally, I was like, okay, so thank you for talking to me. I really want to know, do you want me in or not? And she was like, I'll be real honest with you. You don't qualify. And I was like, I just drove 5 hours. I'm not going back again. But then she said, but I'll tell you what. I'll let you come for 1 year. I will give you 1 year. I'm not letting you into the program, but I will give you 1 year to come, take all the classes. At the end of that 1 year, you come talk to me again, and if you did well, maybe you can get into the program. And I was like, all right, I got a maybe, right? I got a maybe. So I left with a little bit of hope, but then I was like, okay, really, I'm going to give up a year of my life, and I'm going to have to pay for this whole year of school. I don't know what I'm getting into, and at the end of that year, I could lose it all, right? I could lose it all. I could go a whole year, and she could say, sorry, no, it's not going to be you, or she could say, yeah, but I did it, right? I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. I moved, I went, I worked hard for that year. I mean, literally, I would wake up early in the morning. I would be in the library. At that time, our library closed at noon. And it would be me and all the international students sitting there at the library studying. I became friends with people from China and Korea, because they were the only hard workers. They were the only ones that were there at midnight studying. Everybody else was out partying. So it was me and the Chinese people up until midnight. Every day, we would close the library down, and next thing, 8 o'clock in the morning, we would open up the library again. And I would study every single day. I mean, I worked hard for that year. and I was able to get straight A's. I mean, I never failed that year at straight A's for 1 year. Amen. And at the end of that 1 year, I didn't even have to call the lady. The lady called me, and this time she had several professors with her. She did. She had several professors with her, and they sat me down and they said, hey, we know you're not formally in the program. We all want you in the program, and when you get in, you have to work one-on-one with a mentor, and so usually you ask for the mentor you want. So in this case, it was backwards. I had a row of mentors, and then they were asking me, we all want to work with you. Who do you choose, right? So it was a complete turnaround just 12 months later, right? And so I learned from that story that I was an ordinary person. And some of the people that told me you don't have the right qualifications, they were right. I didn't have the right qualifications, right? But God did something extraordinary, right? Amen. He did something extraordinary by giving me the opportunity, and he did something extraordinary by allowing me to grow into the position he was calling me to be in, right? I really was not ready. UF really shouldn't have accepted me. They really shouldn't have. I was not ready. But what God did is he gave me the opportunity to learn, and he gave me the opportunity to grow into the person he was calling me to be, right? So just because you are not where you need to be to step into your calling today doesn't mean that you can't start on that journey, right? That is part of the reason why God is calling you. It's not so that you become whoever it is that you're going to become. It's so that you experience God in the process. That's the greater part of the calling. As I was preparing for today, I was looking for, examples about this, and I ran across T.D. Jakes. He was actually sharing his own testimony. As you know, T.D. Jakes is an amazing preacher, but he's a lot of other things. So he's like a movie producer, a music producer. He does many, many things. And he was telling his story about when him and his wife were just starting in the ministry, what they wanted to do was plays, so like drama, skits, plays. And so, he wrote the book, Woman Thou Art Loosed, right? And so he had that theme of women that are loosed, and him and his wife decided that they were going to go on tour and they were going to do plays of Woman Thou Art Loosed. And so they started in Atlanta, right, thinking that they would have a really good response in Atlanta. They didn't. They actually went broke trying to do that play. He describes it as, I was left with my t-shirt at the end of that process, right? So he had this dream and this vision that he was going to write plays and these were going to be successful. He was going to tour the country, and he ended up going broke on his first play. But coincidentally, at that time, there was this guy in that same city of Atlanta called Tyler Perry, who, by the way, was also broke at that time, right? Somehow the two of them got together. A movie producer overheard the idea of Woman Thou Art Loosed, and then it kicked from there. And T.D. Jakes was explaining that the vast majority of his successes were really accidental, right? He never had in his mind that he was going to go into producing movies. Like, that was not the thing that he was looking to do. And he said many of the things that he has done, he really has stumbled upon them just because he was at least obedient in trying to pursue God's calling for his life. He didn't sit in his couch or sit in his hometown waiting for a big opportunity. He went out on a limb and he tried it and he failed, right? But out of his failure came about the calling that God had over his life. Same thing happens to us. I mean, we cannot be afraid of failure. You can't be afraid to try something because you think you're going to fail. You can't be afraid to open your business because you're afraid you're going to go bankrupt. You have to take that risk, And if you do go bankrupt, in the process of going bankrupt, you might find what your next step is, right? We can't underestimate that God can use those mistakes. So reason number one why we sometimes miss God's calling is because we don't recognize his voice. Reason number two is because sometimes we think he's calling us to do something that's beyond our capacity, more than we think we could do. Reason number three is that we think God has given up on us, right? A lot of us think God's done. I've messed up too many times. I've done too many bad things. I have waited too long to answer my calling. My calling is now dead, right? I've sat on it so long that it's too late now. That is not the case at all. If we go back to Samuel's story, how many times did God continue to call Samuel, right? he kept calling Samuel and calling Samuel and calling Samuel until Samuel finally answered. God is not going to give up on you, right? He does not give up on you. If you look at the Bible and the people that God has used in the Bible and you look at their stories, you would be amazed at what God and who God uses. See, we tend to focus on the product of the person. We focus on all of the good things that they've done, but we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about people's history, right? But the Bible has some interesting history in the people that God used. Take Noah, for instance. Noah's the guy that built the big boat, right, where the flood was coming. Did you know that Noah was a drunk? Did you know that before Noah built the boat, his sons had to go and like pick him up because he was so drunk that he couldn't even function? He went on to build the ark. Abraham, when Abraham was used by God, he was an older man already. Some of us think I'm too young or I'm too old. Some of us think God is done with me, like my life is unable to produce more. That is not the case. Abraham was the father of many nations at retirement age, you know. God is never, never done with us. Moses, he was a stutterer. Rahab was a prostitute. Rahab was a prostitute that God used to offer protection to spies from Israel. So God can use her. He changed her life completely after that moment. David, he was an adulterer. He was a murderer. Jonah, he ran from God, right? So the Bible is really, really consistent about showing us that it is never too late, right? There is nothing so bad that you have done that God cannot turn around for good, right? That's the kind of God that we serve. So it is never, never too late. Reason number 4. One of the reasons we miss God's calling over our lives is because we put more trust in wealth and in money than we do in God. And this is my favorite because this is one of the ones that I struggled with the most. For those of you that were here this last Wednesday, we read from 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17. I'll read it to you. It says, "Commend those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment." On Wednesday, the preacher was sharing that a lot of us read that verse and we think that doesn't apply to me because I'm not rich. I don't have a lot of money, right? I don't have a lot of money, so how could I put my trust in money if I don't have money to begin with? But the mistake that sometimes we make is that we are putting our trust in the money that we don't have, right? We are thinking, I cannot step into God's calling for my life because I don't have the money that it takes to step into God's calling for my life. You're putting your trust in money. You're putting your trust in money. You are telling God, I cannot do this because I don't have the money to do it. I don't trust you, God, to make a way. Now, if I had the money, then I would do it, right? When we take that mentality, we're putting our trust in money, right? Some of us are waiting for money to come our way before we go back to school. Some of us are waiting to have money in the bank before we start our own business or before we at least start planning for that business. You can't do that. You have to allow God to be your provider. You can't let money hold you back, right? Now, obviously, if you have zero money in the bank, you're not going to open a business tomorrow, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't start getting your business plan together, right? That doesn't mean you can't start putting it on paper. That doesn't mean you can't start talking to people who own their own businesses and start asking them, hey, how did you get into it? How much money do I need? You know, you got to start somewhere, right? But some of us do nothing because we don't have the money to do it. And when we do that, we're putting our trust more in money than we are in God. And I say this is my favorite one because God really, really worked in me in this area. I'm very conservative when it comes to budgeting, and I don't like to spend money that I don't have, and so I'm really, really careful about this. But when God was calling me, that was one of my struggles, was how in the world am I going to get to Panama? How am I going to get to Venezuela or wherever it is you're calling me to go? How am I going to go to graduate school? Do you know how much money doctors owe when they're done? Like my colleagues, my friends, average debt that they have is $250,000 when they get out of school. $250,000. that alone is enough to get me to say no. I don't want to have $250,000 debt when I get out of school. It's going to take me my whole life to pay that back. And so I really, really struggled with that. And I kind of already had it in my mind. I was like, if I'm going to do this, I'm not going to do this borrowing money from people. There is no way that I'm going to borrow $250,000 to have this dream come about. I mean, God didn't call us to live that kind of life in debt. I mean, sometimes we do have to take loans to do certain things, but not $250,000 worth. So I was like, okay, God, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to walk. I'm going to do this. And God has done some crazy things when it comes to money and this calling that he had, starting with school. So when I first applied to schools, that was my worry was, how am I going to pay for this? Right before I was starting school, must have been like literally 2 weeks before I was starting school, my university calls me and they say, hey, we have some scholarship money. Are you interested in applying for it? And I was like, yeah, I'm interested. So I went. The application was a 1-pager. I had to do an interview. Week later, 75% of your school's paid. That's it. It was paid. 75% is there. And I was like, wow, I didn't even have to do anything. All I had to do was apply. That is all I had to do is say, please consider me, put in the application, and then it happened on its own. Another crazy experience, I think I've shared before, for the missions work that I felt like God was calling me to do. One of the trips that I went on was to South Africa. That was a really, really expensive trip to be able to fly that far across the country. And so I did my best to raise whatever money I could. So I would wash cars. I had a lot of people help me. I had this really cool lady from a church who made pens. Those annoying pens they have at the doctor's offices? She made those and sold them. I don't know who bought them, but she made some money and gave me a little bit of money. But bottom line is we needed I think it was like $5,000 to be able to make it on this trip. And it was like a summer-long trip. It wasn't a quick trip. And we were going to travel with the Zulu tribe. We were going to go to many, many schools doing HIV education and teaching them about God and the Word. And so we needed a lot of money to be able to do that. And so I had about $2,000 that I had raised. And I started praying, saying, God, hey, what can I do? What do you want me to do? And one of the things that he told me to do was, I want you to help pay for somebody else's mission trip. And I was like, God, I could barely pay for my own. How am I going to pay for somebody else's trip? And so God started telling me, you need to give some of your own money. So I had a job. I worked part-time. You need to start donating some of your money to make somebody else's dream come possible, to help somebody else fulfill their calling. So I said, fine, I'm going to do that. Every extra money that I had, instead of putting it into my own mission trip, I would give it to other people that I knew were going into missions. So I would sow into other people's dream and other people that had the same vision I had, right? I wasn't just randomly sowing into other people. I was sowing into people who were doing the same thing I felt God was calling me to do. So that's one thing that I did. So that's approaching. The deadline to turn in the money is approaching. I'm giving all my money away. I only have about $2,000 out of the $5,000 that I need. And I had a mentor at that time through my university, and we would go out to lunch periodically. So I went out with my mentor. We're sitting there it was Applebee's. So we were at Applebee's, and I was telling him I was going to Africa, and I really wanted to go. And he was asking me, well, how much money do you have? And I told him how much money I had, and he got out this little napkin, these little tiny napkins they have at Applebee's. And he pushed it over to my side with a pen, and he said, I want you to write on that pen how much money you want me to give you. Wow. That's what he said. Just write however much money you want me to give you. And I looked at him and I said, it's a lot of money. And I was like, you don't want me to write on this napkin the amount of money I need. And he said, put on that napkin the amount of money you want me to give you. So I gave him the balance of my trip, which is about $3,200 something. So